affirming that war is a crime against humanity. The War Resisters League are determined not to support any kind of war, international or civil, and to strive nonviolently for the removal of the causes of war, including racism, sexism, and all forms of human exploitation. With those words, nearly 100 years ago, the War Resisters League were formed. And we are so excited to come together here tonight to celebrate those 100 years with talks about resistance past, present, and future. War Resisters League, happy birthday. Now, my name is Matt Meyer, and technically at the moment I serve as the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association.
And hi, my name is Habiba Choudhury, and I'm a student of Wellesley College, and I am also a student activist and organizer and helping out to present here.
And I want to say that Habiba was also, and is also, one of the first class alumni of the Consortium of North American Peace Programs. And as a young student activist that works with IPRA, International Peace Research Association, we are both excited and proud to connect to and be allies of and supporters of the War Resisters League. It's also true that once upon a time, a maybe different lifetime ago, I was the War Resisters League's youngest chairperson and the last chairperson in the history of WL. So for those of you who have long memories or short ones, for those of you who are new to this or who have been with this for a while, we're here tonight for a few different things which we're going to try to connect in together. First, a number of you know that this event, the first major public event of the War Resisters League 100th anniversary, which New York City WL is hosting, is connected to the showing of the film The Boys Who Said No. And a number of you, hopefully, in registering for this event, got information about how to view that. Those of us who are organizing the event, who tend to have slightly grayer hair than others, were informed by the youth that the best way of showing films were not to actually have a film showing in person, but to give people the links so that they could see the film on their own in the comfort of their own homes. If you did that, great, there will not be any quizzes. If you did not do that, there still is probably a chance for you to do so. But this event tonight is for an in-person, interactive celebration. So we have 3 panelists and a number of you in the audience who have different pieces of this history. We're going to hear some stories, some directly from the film and about the film, some not so much about the film, and some since the film. And so we're very honored to have these 3 panelists. We're very honored to have all of you here. And again, the conversations can range from everything regarding the last 100 years, everything regarding the Vietnam era resistance that the Boys Who Say No film was about, focusing on about 50 or a little over 50 years ago, and everything that happened in the last 50 years and going forward. So without further ado, we're going to ask each of our speakers to speak for roughly 10 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up to conversation.
So the first speaker is Edward Hasbrouck. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Like Hasbrouck Heights.
Just to introduce, Edward has been a draft resistant organizer since the early 1980s. In 1983 to 1984, he was imprisoned for 4.5 months as one of 20 people selected for prosecution for refusing to register with the U.S. Selective Service System. In 2019, he was the only draft resistor invited to testify before the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service at its hearing on whether to continue, expand, or end draft registration. He maintains the definitive website about the draft registration, and draft resistance in the USA since 1980 at resistors.info.
Edward, take it away.
Thank you, Habiba and Matt. Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be here with elders I honor for your role in resistance past, activists carrying on resistance present, and youth I look to and hope to learn from as an ally to resistance future. It's not often that we step back to think about the long arc of our resistance, or that I'm invited to sum up my life's work in 10 minutes. The draft for the US war in Indochina, the resistance to which is chronicled in The Boys Who Said No, ended in 1973. So if tonight's discussion is the second half of a two-part program, of which Act 1 was the film, it's perhaps appropriate that I will focus on the second half of WRL's life, and particularly on the history of draft resistance since 1973. When we think about the draft and draft resistance, we tend to focus on the years when the draft was in effect. But that may be getting cause and effect backwards. The absence of a draft is evidence not that draft resistance was unneeded, but that resistance has been successful. One of the reasons we haven't had a draft for the last 50 years is the widespread and almost entirely spontaneous and unorganized resistance to draft registration that has been sustained continuously by young people since 1980. Compliance with selective service registration requirements is lower today than it was during any time when people in the US were being drafted. Most young men register for the draft only if it's automatic when they get a driver's license. It is in some states, including New York, but not in others, including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and most significantly, California. The requirement for men ages 18 to 26 to report to selective service each time they change their address is, as the chair of the House Armed Services Committee noted last year, universally ignored. Even the former director of selective service has testified that the registration database is so incomplete and inaccurate as to be, quote, less than useless, end quote, for an actual draft. Why does preventing the draft matter, though? The goal of draft resistance, as distinct from conscientious objection, is not to opt ourselves out of participation in war, but by depriving the military of our human materiel to deter and constrain war makers and impede the war effort. The US has made wars without a draft, of course. Wars fought by economic conscripts, by members of the reserves and the National Guard who thought they would only be weekend warriors, by proxy forces, by mercenaries. It's hard to see the success of our resistance through the smoke of those wars. The US war in Indochina went on for 20 years, longer than any previous US war except the settlers' war of genocide against indigenous Americans. Who could have imagined when the US war in Indochina ended that it would be followed by 30 years of war in Iraq, much less by 40 years of war in Afghanistan, with the US on one side for 20 years and on another side for the next 20. Allow me to note parenthetically that the pretext for resuming draft registration in 1980 was to send a message of US popular support for military intervention in Afghanistan, at a time when the US was arming and supporting the people who would come to call themselves Al-Qaeda. The US government put me in prison for refusing to agree to fight on the side of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. But I digress. As Dan Ellsberg has pointed out, the last 50 years of war would have been even more deadly had a draft been in effect. The existence of a system of conscription makes military adventurism more likely, as we have seen in Russia in the last year, by giving war planners the illusion that they don't need to think about whether enough people will volunteer to fight their wars. Even the existence of draft registration creates the false perception that the draft is available as a fallback option. That's why it's so important to take the next step from having prevented the draft to abolishing draft registration and getting the government to admit that the draft is not an option and to remove it from the arsenal of war planning. Young draft resistors have done the heavy lifting, but we still need to claim and realize their victory. Preventing a draft isn't our only success in this period. Both protest, which seeks to persuade those in power, and resistance, which seeks to wield the power of nonviolent coercion, can be Gandhian forms of nonviolent action. Some of you may have seen the more recent film, The Movement and the Madman, which tells the story of the Vietnam moratorium as a parallel in protest to the resistance story told in The Boys Who Said No. President Nixon claimed to be watching football on TV and ignoring the protesters surrounding the White House, but in fact, the moratorium dissuaded Nixon and his advisors from a planned nuclear attack on Vietnam. I suspect, although I do not know, that there is an as yet untold sequel or second act to that story. The largest gathering in one place for a political purpose in US history was on June 12, 1982, when more than 1 million people overflowed Central Park and its surroundings in a show of support for unilateral nuclear disarmament. That turnout was driven by our fear that President Reagan would launch a nuclear first strike against what he called the evil empire. In documents made public later in draft registration cases, Reagan administration officials discussed their fear of arousing the anti-nuclear and student movements. We may never know the full story, but I believe that the June 12th mobilization made a significant contribution to saving the world from nuclear annihilation. I'm preaching to the choir. But resistance is a phenomenon, and only sometimes a movement. There are many intersections between war resistance and other movements. And I'd like to highlight 2 steps forward, both related to sexuality and gender, and 1 step back related to age, that the draft resistance movement has made in the last 50 years. As someone who came into the draft resistance movement as a sexual naif, or perhaps as a Q for questioning in the spectrum of LGBTQ, I owe a huge debt of consciousness raising to my feminist and queer comrades in resistance. I think our movement owes them a great deal too. With respect to sexuality, the draft resistance movement, and WRL specifically, has moved from being willing to hire Bayard Rustin in spite of his being gay, as long as he kept himself closeted, to allowing Dave McReynolds to come out in the pages of Win magazine, while arguing explicitly in that marvelous article, coming out article, that being gay was irrelevant to his work for WRL, to gay draft resistors in the 1980s and after, perhaps most prominently my queer comrade Stardust, speaking publicly about how resistance to the draft is part of their resistance to heteronormative masculinity. We've gone from draft resistors can't admit to being gay to you can be a draft resistor in spite of being gay to we're here in the resistance because we're queer. That's progress. The politics of gay liberation, particularly the role played by coming out in both empowering oneself and influencing others, have made an invaluable contribution to our understanding of the relationship between the closeted mass movement of non-compliance with draft registration and the much smaller movement of public non-registration. James C. Scott, in Domination in the Arts of Resistance, describes as typical a synergy between large-scale but silent subaltern shirking and smaller movements of direct confrontation, often among those with more privilege to withstand retaliation. Openly gay men, openly defying the draft, apply the same tactics to encouraging people who have violated the draft law to speak publicly about doing so that they apply to encouraging gay people to come out of the closet. In both cases, coming out is essential to getting people outside those communities to believe that they even exist. At the same time, much of the draft resistance movement has taken a big step backward in its understanding or even its awareness of the relationship between draft resistance and youth liberation. There are many sources of war resistance. I came to draft resistance and pacifism by way of youth liberation, and I was won over to feminism by Shulamith Firestone's analysis in The Dialectic of Sex, of sexism and ageism, and the common cause of women and young people in resistance to patriarchy as the illegitimate assertion of authority by older men over both women and young people. 50 years ago, it was widely recognized that age was a dimension of oppression and that the draft was, in part, an expression of the ageist contempt of the old for the lives of the young. That's as true today as ever, but many who were part of the youth movement have forgotten the political analysis of youth liberation. And too little of our thinking about allyship and power relations between more and less privileged groups has been applied to age relationships. As potential draftees, young people have been misconceptualized as powerless victims we older people need to protect against conscription, rather than as power wielding their power non-violently to withhold their labor from the war machine as a way to protect us all, including old people, against the larger and longer wars that a draft would enable. The greatest victims of a draft, after all, are not draftees, but those against whom draftees are weaponized in war. Ageism by older people against younger people is as much old people's problem as sexism is men's problem or racism is white people's problem. Our ageism as old people holds back the potential of our movement. I am here with you to celebrate our war resistance, to celebrate our survival, which is testimony to the success of that resistance, and to celebrate and support, as an ally to youth liberation, the resistance by young people on which our future depends. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, for that beautiful speech. It was very powerful. So now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Greg Payton. He was a U.S. Army Vietnam veteran from 1967 to 1969. He is also the member and spokesperson for Vietnam Veterans Against the War and Black Veterans for Social Justice. He has told his story to audiences in more than a dozen countries on 5 continents. In addition to his leadership in the War Resisters League and War Resisters International, he has been a leading spokesperson of Labor Against War and the American Friends Service Committee.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, it's a tremendous honor to be here with these activists and all those that I've noticed that when I first came to WRL as a neophyte, not really understanding too much about anything. And, you know, just to go back a little bit, I'm raised in Jersey City in a housing project called Montgomery Gardens. And out of some of 15 guys I hung out with, 11 of us got drafted. Out of 11 of us that got drafted, 7 of us went to Vietnam, and only 4 of us came back. You know, so when I went to Vietnam, I went because I didn't want to go to jail. I didn't know anything about conscientious objection. I didn't know anything about running to Canada. I wish I would have went to Canada. I would have went to McGill, got a master's. I'd be working on Madison Avenue. You know, I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. And what happened is that when I went to Vietnam, I was so naive, I thought that, I'll just do what I'm supposed to do and I'll be able to come home. Well, for the first time in my life, I was faced with overt racism that I never really experienced before. And you have to remember, when you're in a war zone and people say they don't like you, everybody has a weapon. So this racism turned into attacks, you know, by American soldiers on some of us. Certainly we retaliated, but it led me to start questioning the behavior of what was going on. It started with, you know, your new recruit, you're going to do clean latrine pits, you're going to burn feces. That's what you do when you first come. But then when the next guys come, who happen to be a group of white soldiers, they didn't get the same jobs. We were still doing the menial work. So I questioned it because I didn't know any better. And they put a target on me. So they began to ostracize me. For give you an example, they would say, you would see a movie tonight, but Private Payton messed up, so we're not going to see a movie. So a lot of people didn't like that. It actually, the bottom line, it resulted in me going AWOL, and I got caught in Saigon, and I went to the LBJ, the Long Binh jail. There was a jail in Long Binh. It was pretty much like the jails in America, 99% black. And in Long Binh, which was not for the faint-hearted, it was a really, you know, it was no joke. They made a decision one night, I was part of that planning thing, that they were going to riot. The food was bad, they were giving us dehydrated food and various different things. So there was a riot in the Long Binh jail. And it burnt down. Many people in the States didn't know about this. And a lot of people were killed, and you know, a lot of stuff happened. I left Vietnam very shortly after that, and I came home. And I didn't know what PTSD was. I didn't know about any of that stuff. I've ended up getting addicted being on the streets. I went to the VA for help at somebody's suggestion, and a group of veterans came and they helped me through my recovery from addiction. Just for a point, June 3rd, it'll be 37 years. All right. So they helped me through my addiction, and they were members of a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And as a result of that, I began to get a clearer understanding of, we were cannon fodder for the war. I got drafted June 22nd, 1967. I was in Vietnam for Thanksgiving dinner. You know, so there was no reason, I mean, you know, it's amazing the psychological effects of war, how they can take a guy that I was raised in Catholic school and all this, and give me a gun in 8 weeks and tell me to shoot somebody. You know, so the psychological effects of that are tremendous. So when I began to rehab and got better, I began to go out and speak to people, students in classrooms and different things about what was going on. As a result, I got involved, I met Meyer, and I got involved with the War Resisters League. And I remember the first day I went to what they call a national committee meeting. It was a cold morning. It was like, I think it was on Rivington Street somewhere. And I opened the door, it was cold, and I saw a sea of white faces. And I was like, damn, you know, like what, you know. So what happened, when I found out, man, that these were some of the most compassionate people, the most dedicated people I've ever seen for a cause. They began to, you know, really give me an insight, education on what is really going on in the planet and what we can do to make a difference. And I've seen people dedicate their lives to this movement. I actually haven't done anything else but protest their whole life. And now I see families of war resistors that are now beginning to emerge as carrying the banner of this stuff. I want to talk about Marilyn Meyer. She was with the local, when I met Marilyn, that's Matt's mom, and may she rest in peace. That's Matt's mom, and you know, the givingness of people. I just want to say, I was trying to get a passport. I was fortunate enough to go to South Africa during apartheid. And Matt sort of talked me into it. But one of the things was I had to get a new passport. And I was like, I can't go. You know, I had been to Vietnam, which is a communist country, and they probably wouldn't have let me in. To make a long story short, Marilyn Meyer stood in line for me for several hours till I can get to New York to get. That's what I'm trying to say, the dedication that these folks had to, you know, make a change and to begin and to continue to do things that were just like, to me, it was just like, wow, amazing. So the education I learned. Ralph DeGia, you know, another person, man, who I met and just had a knowledge. He was a World War II draft resister, and he told me, you know, so many stories about different things. You know, that's what I'm saying, that the insight and the knowledge I learned from just being involved with this group, this gave me a tremendous insight on what was going on. So when I began to do my traveling, I began to talk around, there were points and speaking points that I knew about very clearly, because a lot of people in here instructed me in these points. So I'm forever grateful for being able to be associated with a group like the War Resisters League. 100 years. I mean, 100 years. And one of the things that I'm most grateful for is that in my community, when there weren't any organizing and people didn't come into my community and tell me about it, I could bring this information back to my community. I'm so proud of the fact that I'm one of the people that can begin to make people think differently, their thought patterns about what was going on, you know, and maybe making better decisions and choices for themselves, you know. And so that was one of the things that I got from being associated with you. So I just want to say that I'm internally grateful, very honored to be here. And I believe, and I'm very optimistic about the future. I believe that with all the things that we see now, sometimes those of us that have been struggling for so long say, man, what's going on? I think this is the end of it. I think that this is their last gasp. They're like, oh, we got to change it, we got to change it. Yeah, this is the last gasp. I believe in the future, and this is one of them, and I believe in her. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure how to do the next introduction. Mandy Carter is a sister and a mentor and a visionary inspiration for many decades since my earliest days. I'm just going to read some stuff,
No.
but there's too much to read, so I'm going to skip around. It says in one of the many biographies, Mandy Carter is a Southern African-American lesbian with a 50-plus year movement history of social, racial, and LGBT justice organizing. Raised in 2 orphanages and a foster home for her first 18 years in this very state of New York, Ms. Carter attributes the influences of the Quaker-based American Friends Service Committee, the former Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, and the War Resistance League for her sustained multiracial and multi-issue organizing. It was specifically Mandy's participation in Dr. Martin Luther King's inspired 1968 Poor People's Campaign, organized by Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that solidified her sustained commitment to nonviolence and lifelong organizing. She has been amongst too many things to name, helped co-found 2 groundbreaking organizations, Southerners on New Ground, Song, and the National Black Justice Coalition. She was Song's executive director from 2003 to 2005. She has received many honors, including the Union Medal, the highest honor from Union Theological Seminary, and she helped organize diverse, broad-based participation for the 50th anniversary of the 1963 Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. Wow, it's going to be more than 50 a few years from now. Okay. Mandy was the Bride Rest and Commemoration Project coordinator for the National Black Justice Coalition, one of the key people commemorating Bayard's 100th anniversary. She's a former member of the Democratic National Committee's LGBT Caucus, Black Caucus, and Women's Caucus, and she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as part of the 1,000 Women for Nobel Prize in 2005. And I guess I'm going to end just by saying this. I'm thinking that one time that we were together, and Mandy and I I've had the privilege and honor of being with Mandy in lots of different forums, small and large, but one time that you and I shared a stage for a War Resistance League thing, also had Greg Payton and Elizabeth Betita Martinez.
Oh, yes, I know where you're going.
And Betita, who was an iconic figure in Chicana history, Betita and Greg and Mandy and I were having this conversation about what King called the 3 pillars, racism, militarism, and materialism. And eventually, that conversation grew into a book that Mandy, Betita, and I co-edited. We Have Not Been Moved, Resisting Racism and Militarism in 21st Century America. Well, Mandy, we're still in 21st century America and we're still resisting. Please help me in welcoming the extraordinary Mandy Carter.
Thank you so much. I bring you greetings from Durham, North Carolina, where I just drove from there to be here with y'all. And on a very personal note, if we did a go-around right now and then went around the room, how'd we all end up here? Because I heard your story, I heard your story, and I heard your story. I think sometimes when you look at herstory or history, if we don't slow down long enough to say, what was your journey? And also a little humbled. I'm sitting here thinking about, and I have a little quick story. Being raised, at the age of 18, you age out of the system. I was up at Schenectady Children's Home in Schenectady, went to Mount Pleasant High School. The game changer was a social studies teacher. I was the class of 1966. Jack Hickey brought someone in from an organization I had never heard of before, the American Friends Service Committee, why I'm here all these years later. But if we went around the room and see who else been touched by that. One of the things that I really been struck by, and I'm not going to really give more of a rap, but more of sort of like a flow of thoughts, because I've really been pondering a lot about this a lot lately. I was sitting here thinking about, for those of us born, post-World War II baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, if anyone remembers, I graduated high school in 1966. I remember very distinctly when King gave that speech at Riverside, April 4th, 1967. Not because of Vietnam, but also he talked about the other issue of economic justice. That was the birth of the Poor People's Campaign. And I remember being in Schenectady, New York, you had the draft, but for black folk, let's have that conversation, about who was really kind of being on the front lines, what that might have been. But I think what I was struck by when King gave that speech, I didn't know him or anything like that, but I was like, we were all a little too young for the March on Washington. This gets into Bayard. I have to do props to Bayard Rustin and also Walter Nagel, who's also here as well, partner of and carrying on the legacy. What I was struck by about what was happening in Mount Pleasant High School, who was ending up being drafted, who was, and who was able to get all this deferments, but also when King gave that speech, remember one of the most important things he said was, why are we sending black men 8,000 miles away to kill other people of color in the name of democracy when we didn't have it when they left and didn't have it when they came back? And then he asked a question about economic justice. So as a woman, didn't have to worry about being drafted, but that struck me. And after, on April 4, '68, it was one of those days you knew exactly where you were when the news came that King had been assassinated in Memphis. What was he there for? Helping the black garbage workers to get a living wage. Saw the connection. And so even though he had been murdered in April 4, '68, one of the questions was that was going to be the Poor People's Campaign right here in on the mall, Resurrection City. Was anyone there in 1968? If you might have heard about that. Because one of the questions was whether or not they would continue to do that given King had just been assassinated. One of the most important things they decided to say, make sure they had that happened. Prior to that, I hitchhiked out to San Francisco in the summer of 1967, the summer of love. Ended up going to the Haight-Ashbury switchboard. They had a little Rolodex, and they said that if anyone's coming into San Francisco and you need a place to stay, you know what card they pulled? Vincent O'Connor of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. You can't make this stuff up, y'all. Turns out the Catholic Peace Fellowship was having a meeting down at the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence and the Warrior Sisters League to have the first ever nonviolent civil disobedience action. Where? At the Oakland Induction Center. Got arrested, but I'll just say, I think one of the most important things we said, jail, no bail. We went to jail. And you know who was sitting in those jails? Y'all got it, black women, 99% black men. But to have the opportunity to be in those jails, having the conversation, and I'll do it real quick, why y'all here? We're here because of that war in Vietnam. Oh, that's my husband, that's my cousin, that's my brother, because what they were saying is, judges were saying, you got NOM or jail, what's the option for you? Think about the impact that that had. But I also want to kind of fast forward. Well, I've really been struck by the post-World War II baby boomers. You know, we used to be the largest number, wherever you lived, wherever you might have been. But you know who has the highest numbers now? 18 to 40-year-olds. That's what excites me. I want to know how we're going to figure out how we keep the legacy, pass it on, carry it on. But also the other demographic, real quick, women are now the numerical majority. People of color will be soon. But keeping in mind who is already here indigenous to these lands, thinking about just to kind of like where we've been, what the potential is. I'm looking at some very familiar faces here. Why are y'all here? Why are you still here? What is it? What keeps us engaged? And I'm thinking about that. I just want to do some little bit of show and tell, just because I'm thinking about if the war in Vietnam was the thing, but like you said, the Warrior Sisters League says believing all wars are a crime against humanity, international, civil. Why do we continue to have a thing called economic conscription? Might not be a draft, they might have draft economic conscription. They're not telling you to come kill people, they're telling you can get a job, you can get an education, you get some housing. And if that's the inducement about what they need to do to fill those ranks, one has to wonder what the options are. So I just want to just say, King gave that speech April 4th. I've got the little thing here. He got killed April 4, '68. And because of the war in Vietnam, all the men were going to jail. That left a lot of women to run those offices. And all of a sudden, women were deciding that we might want to talk about feminism and nonviolence, when, you know, the whole attitude about what it means to be a part of like the living society, whatever that. I got arrested in 1967. I was in jail, and a woman named Jane Shulman from the Warrior Sisters League said, "Hi, my name is Jane Shulman. I'd like to invite you to a potluck that we're having in San Francisco." And I went to that potluck, And I got hired in 1969, and here's the calendar to prove it. I've carried this calendar for all these years, and I'm looking at this room because in a weird way, that's what grounds us, thinking about that. I also want to just do another show and tell of Walter Nagel. We've been trying to get a Bayard Rustin stamp. Can you show that one? We've been trying to get a Bayard Rustin postage stamp, but also when I think about Bayard, I never heard of the guy, and I'll end with this. One thing I really was struck by, Bayard was not about making a name or being so important and all that other stuff. I said, if anyone can figure out, someone said, Bayard who? But Bayard was just more of an inspiration. I think about all the other folk that I know, you might know, and some other names that are part of that. But more importantly, what is it? What inspires us? What keeps us going? How do we continue to make the connections? I live in a very rural part of North Carolina. Y'all living in New York City. I drove up here. I was scared to death. And then I get back, my pace in North Carolina is like this. Here it's like, no, 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 no. I guess I'll end with this. I'm agreeing with you. I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. In our lifetime, black man, son of an interracial marriage, got to be president of this country. And whether you believe in electoral politics or not, think about that. But also I remember thinking about people crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge. Next year is the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer, when people dared to think we can make a change, and how each and every one of us has that incredible potential. But how do you tap into it? What do you want to do with it? How do you inspire? But also practically, can you make a living? Can you figure out how you might be in school, or whether it might be grassroots organizing? And how do we connect? Especially with this COVID thing. I've been on that Zoom thing for 3.5 years. But I'm very optimistic. I mean, again, not if, but when. And I'll end with this. Given, once again, your background, why are we here? But a lot of us are still here, and we have another generation coming into the mix, as that might be. So I always end my conversation by saying, not if, but when, and not only in English, but then who gets to do the outreach? Thank you for my social studies teacher inviting someone from the American Friends Service Committee. Thank you for having extended the invitation. If you don't ask, you don't extend the invitation to figure out. But also, these stories matter. And how do you get that word out, and how do you decide you want to make a difference? And also, part of the 100th Anniversary Committee of the War Resisters League, we're organizing down in Durham and other parts of the country as well. I'll be back up again. I have to head back home, literally tonight, to get back down to Durham. There's some organizing happening in there. But I wouldn't miss this for the world. Because that's where my birth of organizing and my sense of hope and incredible opportunity, all because I happened to be wandering down Hudson Street, ran into this little building, the League for Spiritual Discovery, hitchhiked out to California, got that Rolodex of Vincent O'Connor, and maybe we should make a movie about that, or something like that. All right, hey, thanks y'all.
So we expect that there are more stories out here in the, those of you who have come, by way of questions, by way of comments, by way of answers. So who wants to start us off? How shall we begin this conversation we have some time for now together? We wanted this to be a conversation.
Could you tell them to come up forward at the mic?
I was going to say that, yes, because we both want to hear you, but we also want, and I'll just say there are many special people. All of you are special. All of you here in this group tonight, and one of them is our videographer Joe Friendly, who has for so many years put so much diverse content on now YouTube. But I remember times when he was doing this before there was a YouTube. So Joe's here, and we want this to be on the video as well. So who's going to start us off? Questions, comments? Okay. I'm going to have to say something. I'm going to have to be careful about not saying too much. There are a lot of reunions here tonight, or potential reunions. But when I was 17 or 18, maybe even younger than you. And by the way, Habiba's going to say some words as well. We're not just having her do introductions. But when I first decided to become a public non-registrant, the New York Mobilization for Survival and their coalition against conscription, which had this weird guy from the War Resisters League named Ed Hedeman, who was part of that coalition, put together a press conference. And the headlines of that press conference were, Matt, Michael, and Vince declare that they will take the risk of being public non-registrants. Grace Paley was the MC of that press conference, and I'm Matt. We're not sure who Michael is, but this is Vince.
My name is Vincent Flood. I'm 61 years old. In October of 1979, I turned 18.
Hold the mic closer.
October of 1979, I turned 18. In December of 79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In July of 1980, Jimmy Carter showed great resolve by reinstating the draft. I didn't want to take part in that. So I didn't. Backing up a little bit, the years of when I was 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, I was active in the War Resisters League. And part of the activity was engaging in several civil disobedience actions. One was the Wall Street action, one was the Shore nuclear power plant action, one was getting arrested at the South African embassy when it was an apartheid state. Before every civil disobedience action, nonviolence training was required. And these trainings required a lot of role playing, a lot of education about nonviolence, and the history of civil disobedience. And the role playing in scenarios was very important to me. I got arrested 3 times within like a couple of years. So I went through that training several times. And those lessons stuck with me. So several years later, in 1984, I became an EMT. In 1988, I became a paramedic, and I worked for New York City Emergency Medical Service. And I could say with absolute certainty that those lessons of nonviolence, conflict resolution, and how not to be provoked served me well in my 30-year career as a paramedic with the New York City Emergency Medical Service. So that's why it was very important for me to be here today.
Lovely. Thank you. Do you have a question for anyone? You don't have to.
Does Ed Hedeman remember me?
Okay, I'm going to let that question go to private conversation. Vince, wonderful to see you, but thank you.
Good to see you.
Why'd y'all come? Why are y'all here? Why'd you all want to come today?
Now, I'm sorry. I was asking them to do questions.
Oh.
Now you're asking
Well,
questions.
it's one of those wonderful...
All right, we're going to pass the mic around and have you answer that. But thank you, Vince.
Thank you.
I see someone else who I'd like to... No, leave the seat, because we're having the seat.
Oh, we're bringing...
Yeah, it's a whole Joe, and we're going to have... another generation of activists and other waves and connections. I see one of the key leaders of New York City Extinction Rebellion here. And I know that she wants to say some words and ask a question about making the connections to very much 21st century resistance. And if you don't know about XR, about Extinction Rebellion, some of the modern, very, very modern, including this week, creative direct actions are coming out of that movement. So help me in welcoming for the next common question, Mun Chung, please.
Should I just do an introduction
Whatever,
myself?
sure.
Yeah, so I'll just do an introduction of myself and share a little bit of what I do within the climate movement and kind of where I see we're at. So I'm an immigrant from Malaysia. I came to the US about 12 years ago. I spent some time in Charlotte, North Carolina, spent some time in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and came to New York City about 5 years ago. And at that time, I kind of felt like, wow, I kind of, reached that dream. It was always a dream for a lot of people overseas to have the privilege of actually working in, New York City, one of the biggest city in the world, and sort of thought, this is where, I have success when it comes to my career and everything. But I got exposed to the climate movement, or just the climate emergency in general, in 2019 during the Greta strikes in the city, and I looked into it. Unfortunately, I grew up in a country where climate education is really bad. Only 7% of the population actually is aware of the climate crisis. And when I actually learned about the climate crisis, I think there is nothing else that I needed to spend my time on because it is existential, and I had to do something. And I just felt like I couldn't just turn away and just be about in my daily life and just do the things that I needed to do. I think the thing that speaks to me about Extinction Rebellion in general, which is very similar to the peace movement, is the use of civil disobedience as a tactic. I think the fact that the group actually talks about how the system is incapable of actually fixing itself. Capitalism is incapable of actually fixing the climate crisis is important. And also the fact that we talk about how even the political system, our electoral system, is also incapable of actually fixing the climate crisis. And there is a theory of change that the group goes by, and it's the fact that we think that we do need direct democracy, we do need citizens' assemblies to change the way that we actually advocate for policy changes, is probably the only way that we can actually get the kind of traction that we need to get in society, because the systems that we have in place aren't working. What is unfortunate about the climate crisis or the climate movement in comparison to the peace movement, I do feel like the peace movement is focused on specific events that are happening, whereas, like whether it's you can correct me if you think differently, where I feel like in the peace movement, like you could be having, we could be, in the past it could have been world wars, or it could have been the Vietnam War, but in terms of the climate crisis, it is a global issue that requires change from all governments, all corporations around the world. And the fact that it's also happening now at a point in time of like 50 years of neoliberalism and globalization, that also makes the challenge even harder. And the unfortunate thing about it is, unlike the peace movement, which is solely focused on civil disobedience, is the climate movement actually has a broad range of people with different political ideologies. Right? We have the big greens that work within the system. We have a lot of groups, grassroots groups, that actually focus on lobbying policy, and they still believe in working through our current system. And then you have the more radical groups like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion that actually don't believe that we can get the changes that we actually need to get through the systems that are in place today. Which I think is even harder, right? Because even within the climate movement, we don't agree with each other, which makes it even more difficult than I think what the peace movement, like the collaboration and the coalitions that existed during throughout the peace movement.
Any question or general?
Yeah, I would ask, obviously I have a lot of respect for a lot of you, and I can't believe that you've been doing this for so many years. I got into climate activism not realizing that this is probably a lifelong work. I guess the question that I have for you is, for all of you in the room, is basically, why are, this is a tough question. I don't really know how to phrase it, but I see the lack of, and maybe this is probably a perspective that you guys can share with me. I see the lack of relationship building between the elders and the youth in the climate movement. I see a lot of shaming because there has been, in the past few years through maybe PR companies, that there is a narrative of the youth actually blaming boomers for the problems that we have today. And I wonder, but I haven't seen the elders actually stand up and actually, kind of correct the youth around that narrative, because surely there's been a lot of you that have been really brave and have sacrificed a lot. And I think there is a lot that the youth can actually learn from the older generation.
Wow. Thank you. So let's just, now there are four of you. from different generations. I'm not sure, thank you, by
That's
the way,
good,
for that,
I
amazing.
appreciate
And I'm not sure if things are as unified or as rosy in the peace movement as you said. Nonetheless, let's hear some comments from any of the four of you, and then all of us, yeah.
Go ahead.
Up to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, start, then we'll do generationally right there.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question, Moon. And I completely agree with you. I feel that when it comes to the older generation and the younger generation, there's always this disagreement, and the disagreement comes from the lack of trust. There is no more trust in what our future looks like, and a lot of the youth, they can't accept the fact that past generations are not supporting them in the best way possible. And as someone who's a millennial myself, and I've noticed that when it comes to a lot of the younger people, they've just lost trust, and there's no way to create those beautiful long-term trust and relationships if there's no trust between people from different generations. And for me, I think that's really important to have that trust.
Greg Payton, I think a lot of it has to do with communications. And just a simple thing, as the technology moves on, many of us don't adapt to new technology. So I'll give you an example. I used to call my granddaughter, she wouldn't answer the phone. I call her and I would be hot. You know, calling you. I text her and she texts me back. So now what happens is that, oh, she's gonna answer the text, but she's not gonna pick up the phone. And that's what I think sometimes is that a lot of times also, when we talk about genealogy and understanding where we came from, which I think is important, then sometimes we get the stories from our older people that we did not know. And we did not know who stood up to what or whatever it is. I was just telling everyone, my mother-in-law is 108 years old. She'll be 109 September 14th. But she's very articulate about what happened before, what goes on. She watches the news. She called me up, she shook Obama's hand when he was running for Senate, when he was running for president, and he wasn't the president yet. She called me up and said, you gotta vote for Obama. I said, who? Obama. You know, and that's what I'm saying. So what happens is that if we do not question our people and really figure out what's going on with them, because we think, listen here, my kids, they think they did some stuff, they weren't half as bad as me, you know? But the bottom line is that they don't know that because they haven't had the discussions. So I think communications is a key.
You know what, but great question. You know, I've really been struck about something. Remember I said to you, had Jane Shulman invited me to go to that potluck, I wouldn't have gone. How often do we do anything to really extend the invitation, and depending on how you do it? But also I think, you know what you have now? You have social justice story time for 4-year-old and 5-year-old and 6-year-olds. And if you were to take that in the most rural place, in the most densely city, it's almost like, what are the what's the things, what's the stuff? And then who are the ones to acknowledge it, pass it on and forward. One thing I've really been struck by when we were talking about LGBT, social justice, class, race, there's a similarity around whatever that might be. And then the other question is, and how would you say it in your culture, in your language, you know, we're thinking. But how much can be intentional? Right now, I can tell you 2 things that I think really made a solid difference. Next year is the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. Down in the most rural parts of Mississippi, 1,000 students decided that they wanted to go down there having no idea what could happen or not. Some did not come home alive. 850 black, white, black, whatever. But they all said, we have a mission because it's not about me, it's about how do we collectively make this a we. And whatever your gifts are and whatever you have that you think you can bring to the table or whatever that conversation might be. What I really have been struck by, it's so funny because clean air, clean water, everyone should have access to, you know, if you think of all what would be the things that you put in the table and say whoever you are, however you do your language, you speak, what? And then more importantly, what's the invitation or what are the things that you'd like to put back? But I can tell you one right now, 2024 will probably be one of the most critical election years of our lives. If you don't believe in politics, someone's going to be the mayor. someone's going to be the sheriff. Y'all, I mean, I'm just being honest about that. But then there's also the changing of hearts and minds and the changing of public policy. Hearts and minds of public policy. And each one of us, I guess, depending on who we are, where we are, get to decide how that may be. And then finally, how do you define a win? I'm just curious. I mean, I'll just put it on the table. There's a group that said we'd like to be more diverse, more people of color. How many is enough? And you can ask the same question about anything. I mean, who gets to decide what's enough, and how do you quantify and qualify that? And then also, you know, it might not work this time. You just said it. I think we're in a moment. You see what's happening out here. I'll end with this. When Obama was running, and someone was talking about something, and oh my gosh, you know, and they made a list of everything that was, but not those people. So not black people, no women. I said, who y'all got left? I want to be with these people because these folk got something going on. That's different than being scared about what you don't have. You might look at the potential of what that is, the possibility. But things are happening, but we need the questions and the challenges as well. So FYI.
Can I just add something?
Yes, please. And then you.
It was just a thought that I just had that I had to get out. I believe that one thing that we have to look past is race, class, creed, gender. That's one thing that's separating everyone, and it's definitely the political lines. Everybody is either left or right or center. And if you're part of a particular political party, you cannot agree with certain things. But the main question that we should be asking is, the existence of humanity is under threat right now. And it's under threat because we are on the verge of a nuclear war. And that is what is going to bring humanity back. And it's going to align all of us, regardless of what our beliefs and our upbringing or values are. We can't keep looking at each other because this person is LGBTQ, or if this person is black or white or brown or whatever. The more we keep focusing on these isms, and the more we keep focusing on gender or race, it's just going to keep separating us. And a lot of the youth have just lost trust because they're either part of one party or the other party, and they're too afraid to speak. I have friends who are quietly Republican at Wellesley, and they feel like they can't even speak because it's a liberal school. And there's so many things that they agree with, but it's that fear. So if our youth are fearful of just speaking of what they believe needs to create that justice and that peace, then we have to look beyond these political discrepancies. And I honestly believe that if we cannot look past all these isms, there is no hope. And a lot of the youth have lost hope. And today, the hope that I've felt like I lost, I'm feeling it back inside of me, because it's up to the older generation to continue to tell us, like, look past all of these things and just, what is the main question? Are we going to be alive? Is the next generation going to exist? Don't look at what you look like, because that is just separating us. And I feel like that's exactly what Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, all these great organizers and activists who fought for humanity, for our republic, just understood that we cannot look at people based on where they're from.
That's good. Oops.
Okay.
Well, you've done a remarkably good job of asking more questions than any of us could try to answer. I think, Mandy, you raised a really key question for us as activists and as a movement, in terms of the need to think more clearly about what brought us to this place. And I think we tend to think in terms of, like, what movement, what ideology brought us to that place, but there's also a question of who we are and what's different about us. Look, we are weird people. We're not where most people are. So how are we weird? And what is that? And one of the things I think I want to come out about here that's important, you know, I've been working on a project, a lengthy review of Draft Resister's memoirs from the Vietnam period. And there are more than 50. And people talk about the Vietnam literature, and it's all the literature of the people who went to the war. What about the people who didn't go to the war? I mean, it's as though we were reading about Nazi Germany and only reading the Nazis' biographies and not the biographies of the resistors. Why are the biographies and the stories of the resistors not more prominent in study of the Vietnam generation and their narratives and their history? But anyway, reading those, I mean, a bunch of things stand out about those people. But one of those things that stands out, it leaps out once you've got it in your frame, and it leaps out in my knowledge of my frames, is how many of us are people with Asperger's. Yeah, how many of us are people with Asperger's? And when Greta Thunberg came out here in New York about and made that statement of Asperger's is my superpower, that was a Stonewall moment for people with Asperger's. And that she made it in the context of an interlocking, intersectional double discrimination where it caused her not only to be dismissed as somebody with mental illness, but as a mentally ill child. What an unbelievably bold and strong thing that was. And we need that kind of strength. But it really is, I mean, it really is true that for many people, Asperger's prompts a willingness to be more deviant and to defy social conventions. But it's also that she's a young person, and really one of our sheroes and a youth shero. But I do think when you ask, why aren't older people, pushing back, I want to be in solidarity with young people's angry at the old people who fucked up the world. I really do. That's not a joke, okay? I mean, it's funny, but it's not a joke. And it's a difficult process. Many other people have been working for years trying to figure out what it means to conscientize white people about their racism. What it means, how can you reach people to acknowledge their racism without feeling guilty about being who they are, right? There's a lot, this is a whole thing. How many of us have been to a workshop, to an educational, to training, to help us understand what it means to be white racists and how we can improve and how we can take leadership from the majority of the world's people who are people of color? Almost none of that kind of thinking has been applied to thinking about what it means for us to be old people and how to cope with our ageism and how to relate to young people in a non-ageist way, and how to celebrate and take from them and take leadership. So, I think there's a lot of people in the climate movement who will say, oh yeah, we need to save the world for the young people. But I think we need to get out of the way and help the young people. Help the young people save the world for all of us, because they're the ones who are in the lead. And we need to recognize that, and we need to apply some of these other lessons about dynamics of oppression and about allyship to age relations if we want to make progress, because it is a key question. I think there are few other issues today where it's so clear that the leadership is coming from youth, and that if we do not learn how to learn from them, we're not any of us going to survive. So thank you, young people, for stepping out, and I hope to find ways to follow.
Can I make an observation? We used to be 18 and 19 too. I'm kind of concerned because it's like we're still here. I was 17 years old, and and when we think about not just us but movement, so I'm wondering if there's a way in which you contextualize that question, and also the fact that we're here and how. No shade. I'm just sort of like, well, we're still here, and we've been losing people, and I love them. And as a woman of color, had it not been for Wally and Juanita Nelson, who decided to be the bridge builder, who's going to be the bridge builders? Not everyone wants to be, but who's going to do that always, And so maybe, I'm not sure how I can, I'm sitting here thinking about when you said you were over in Vietnam, like what was your life like that? What do you look at other folk now who might say, I might want to go in, I might not, folk of color or not, family, how do you have this conversation in a way that's not just specific to New York or Durham or something, just and let's just talk international, can we have that conversation? So I'm trying to think if there's ways that you can pose a question, it's almost like I have more of a, I don't know. But sometimes I don't know is a healthy, I don't know. It's a healthy, I don't know. Can we have that conversation about it? You know what I mean? So I think we're in an amazing position of where this is really possible if we're be able to be in the same space. This is the first time I've been in a room with human beings. I've been on that Zoom thing for 3.5 years. I forgot how to interact with people. But anyway, I used to be 17 once. I'm now 75. Oh yeah, and that too. Okay, anyway, I'm just curious.
Well, you know, I edited the War Resistance League calendar some years ago, and it was youth voices in that calendar, and I described myself there as a former youth, which I thought was a badge of some honor. But the fact of the matter is, well, a couple of things. There's, with some intentionality, that New York City War Resistance League, that Ruth Ben and I put together this panel to be diverse, not just in terms of race and in terms of gender, but also in terms of generation. And that we have an intergenerational dialogue, because there's more than 2 or even 4 or 5 perspectives here. And there's also more ability to talk for 7 or 8 hours, which we're not going to do. We're going to speak for another half hour at most, 25 minutes really. And it is also worth saying that yes, these conversations echo conversations we're having internationally. Some of you know I just got back from Chile, from the Latin American Peace Research Association conferences, and they have been for more than a decade now preceding all of their conferences with youth conferences, with the idea that there's explicit youth empowerment built into all of their peace and justice work. And some of us are thinking of going in June to War Resistance international meetings in London that will hopefully also echo some of these concepts and conversations, Global North and Global South. But for this 25 minutes, we want to hear from more of you. So please raise your hand, run up here, and ask your questions or make your comments and introduce yourselves.
And this might be a part 1 and part 4, so you know.
Mandy is organizing one of these a month from now in Durham. You'll get the information shortly. Okay, tell us who you are.
My name is Sally Jones. I live in Staten Island. I'm with Peace Action, but I have become real friends of the War Resisters League here in New York City, and I have been arrested with them because I really appreciate the way they, the consensus meetings that we've had about what we're going to do. I've just really appreciated learning from the War Resisters how to organize. It's been really eye-opening to me, and I appreciate that. My question, however, is, you know, with the war in Ukraine, I have felt so deeply affinity with the Russian anti-war resistors. I've been trying to follow this feminist anti-war resistance movement, and I can translate their Telegram messages in Google Translate, and they're pretty amazing. And I just wanted to ask you, how can we support them, and what can we do?
Wonderful. Wow. Wonderful. And I know we have some concrete answers to that. I'm going to ask, because of the way in which we do these things, if we can have 1 or 2 other questions and then take some more conversation from the panel. So who else would like to make a comment? Please come on up here. And again, introduce yourself. Oh my gosh, look, this person seems to be wearing the same Resistance and Brooklyn t-shirt that I'm wearing. How surprising. Who might you be, young woman?
I'm in a collective with him. And I've been a supporter and a fellow arrestee with the War Resisters League for many a year. While coming, and my name is Meg Starr. Okay. And I'm in Extinction Rebellion. And I have a question right now that's in my mind. I'm hearing from 2 of our young people in the room that humanity is at risk. And it's either at risk from the impending climate crisis or at risk from the impending nuclear war. And I'm not seeing that our broader left is responding as if that was a kind of primary crisis. Like during the Vietnam War era, I think to a certain extent, the war, you know, around the world, Vietnam, and the fact that the primary imperialist power was trying to trounce this little country that was incredibly resisting, became a focus around the world. And to me, my feeling is in my heart that the primary focus right now in the world of the reason for wars is oil and energy, and this period of militarized destruction on the part of the U.S., etc., is focused on defending a system which the majority of the world knows will kill all of us and our planet. And I'm just not feeling that kind of crisis energy from the people I'm closest to and respect the most in many different parts of the movement. Like when, and I'm curious about that, and I don't know if you guys see it that way or you see something else. And I think that's part of the question, between I think that's part of the question between the youth and the elders, because the youth are saying, I'm going to live into this period where, I saw an article, a scientific article saying this might be the last stable summer. And, that's something, that's my question.
Thank you, May. Let's take one more, and then hear from the panel, if we have another. Please. Vicky, can you come up here as well? We'll take both of you.
Yes, we'll take both.
Let's see if we can make these guys brief. 2 comments, and then we'll hear from the panel. Please tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Joe Ergo, and I'm a Vietnam veteran. And I'm also the first Vietnam veteran to go to North Vietnam on a peace mission with Dave McReynolds of the War Resisters League. That's a whole nother bunch of stories. Although I tried to do some research today and find out if I could find David's report on the trip to North Vietnam online, and it's been removed with some photographs from his website. So I'm hoping someday I'll find that again. But the reason I'm here today is because I really want to unite with the last comment around the question and your comment around the threat, the 2 existential threats, along with a bunch of other threats, but the 2 really existential threats of nuclear war. And if you're not following the newspapers, you're really not paying attention to how serious it's coming up in many different dimensions. The reports that not just between US and Russia, but what the United States is preparing with China. It is that serious. And the extinction of the planet is also on schedule if we do not take on this climate crisis. And I think one of the things that is failing is that we do not have a movement in this country that has actually confronted the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is not oil, it's capitalism, imperialism. It is the nature of the very society we're living in that absolutely depends not only on killing people around the planet for profit and for empire, but also on the exploitation of millions of people all over the globe. That everything we live on and are dependent on in this society is absolutely dependent on exploiting people, because our cell phones have products in them that only come from slave labor in Africa. Our clothes only come from women in Bangladesh and Thailand, etc. And American chauvinism is so deep in this society that Americans are not trained at all, they're not thinking at all about the nature of the society we live in, how it's dependent on killing people, and too many people are focused on what's happening to us. It's kind of like talking to a Vietnam veteran who only talks about what's happening to veterans and doesn't talk about all the killing that we did, or any war of soldiers. So, and I think the other threats that The other problems that people are facing is this capitalist imperialist system does not have an answer to the oppression of women. It cannot solve the oppression of Black and Latino and oppressed people in this country. It's proven that, that the only solution they have is killing people on the streets. They cannot solve the immigrant crisis. All of this is coming to a head. And if we do not have a movement of resistance in this country, led by the youth, but a revolutionary movement that actually intends to stop this, then we are in trouble, and we're not going to be able to, get past this. And the last thing I'll say is, and I forgot the last thing I'll say.
Okay. That'll be part 2 in North Carolina. And in case anyone doesn't know you, please introduce yourself.
My name is Vicki Rovier. Throughout my adult life, as I've been active in the anti-war and wider social justice movement, with having ideas that are so outside the mainstream society, it's been a real sustenance to me to have a group with whom I can share my concerns. But I have some concerns that don't get shared so easily. For 17 years, I've been running a free store on my block, and I scavenge people's trash to pull out the valuable items and put them out for people to take. This is mainly an environmental concern, but it certainly has put me in touch with folks on the street, homeless people who make use of the stuff I find and so forth. So it has expanded my horizons in that way. But some people I know are sort of like, ew, and some people are enthusiastic. But it's just sort of like something I don't come out with immediately when I'm introducing myself to nice middle-class folks. And the other thing I wanted to say is when I was, I guess, in college, I read a memoir by a white middle-class woman who discovered that segregation was wrong. And she was really excited by this and wanted to share this with her community. And she would tell people about her discovery, and they were not interested. She got very demoralized. And then she discovered that if she didn't have any expectations for how people were going to react, sometimes she was pleasantly surprised. And I am delighted that you folks are still here, full of hope. I have not had hope for decades, but I made myself open to be pleasantly surprised.
Right. That's right.
Thank you, Vicki.
Yes, thank you, Vicki. Stay here for a second. I'm gonna pass it down so we can have final comments from the group, from Edward down this way. But I want to say something about Vicki first. So back a long time ago, War Resistance League had this very creative idea that because money wasn't the thing, we were going to have people, humans. We were going to export some of our young activists. See, many of us former youth, as having survived that particular thing. And Vicki was one of the young War Resistance League activists who went to, was it Britain or was it before? Went to the War Resistance International headquarters in London and was their staff, very extremely unpaid. Yes, intern, that's the word we use when we don't pay people for full-time work. And that was one of those international connections. And since that time, up until I think me, Vicki was the person who went to the most of the triennial gatherings, and then she missed a few, and I was able to catch up because I've missed it since 1982. Also, one important War Resisters International gathering, and I say this as International Peace Research Association now, had a group of scholars, Michael Rando and Andrew Rigby, and I was there and a few others, and we talked about our books, all of our books, our really excellent, exciting books, and then Vicki was there, and it was clear that her book, Where to Go, a book of, am I getting the name correct?
Where to Go,
Where to Go.
A Guide to Manhattan's Toilets.
So Vicki had self-published this book, and My books sell a couple of hundred, Andrew's a few hundred, maybe Michael's 1,000. Vicky, I think, it's self-published, what, 40,000 books?
13.
Yeah, in any case, by far and away, this cottage industry, sort of very, very grassroots book of Vicky's had reached so many more people than any of the rest of us academics. And it says something, I think, about grassroots activism and about Vicky as well.
I think it's always a challenge how to balance recognizing the existential threats and taking them seriously, while still planning that if we're going to survive, we not only have to do something today, but if we survive, there are going to be things to be done tomorrow and next week and in the next lifetime. So how do you do both? I don't know. In terms, though, of, I do want to speak to the specific question that was raised. What can we do to support war resistors and draft resistors in the military or resisting the draft in Russia and in Ukraine? You know, I have never in my life tried to persuade anybody to oppose the draft. People know they don't want to be cannon fodder. We don't need to talk them into, motivate them into wanting to resist. They need material aid. And what they most want is a sanctuary. One of the most important things for American draft and war resistors during the US war in Indochina was the sanctuary that was offered in Canada. That happened because Canadians organized to make it happen. We need to organize to make a sanctuary in the US. Even the few Russian draft resistors and military resistors who make it here, and most of them can't even get here because we've externalized the borders, which is a whole other question. The ones who get here are being denied asylum and deported. There is a petition calling on the US government to grant asylum, and I would broaden it to say that it should be grant asylum and make it possible for them to get here. For Russian, and I would say it should be also Ukrainian, draft and military resistors, but there is a petition. It's on the Ukraine war page of the WRL website, among other places, links to it on my site and the Center for Conscience and War. A lot of groups have gotten behind it. That's something concrete you can do. Talk to your congressman, push them. This is a movement for us to make a sanctuary for people who are doing the right thing in that war. A couple other things, just while I'm on this note of what is to be done, things that we can do. I mentioned in my talk that Congress is actually talking about draft registration for the first time in decades. It's a window of opportunity. We are looking for a new sponsor in Congress since the previous champion retired to reintroduce the Selective Service Repeal Act. Talk to your congressman about supporting, finally, putting a stake through the heart of ending draft registration. There's also the possibility to get involved in tax resistance, which many of us are. But the final thing I want to add to that agenda of what can be done, to go back to this question of support for youth. During the US war in Indochina, young people's lives were channeled by the Selective Service System, deliberately channeled by the Selective Service System into ways that served the war. The channeling mechanism today that forces young people to make these difficult choices about whether they can afford to speak out is student debt. If we want to support youth movements, we need to include forgiveness of all student debt and a shift to a non-debt-based financing that recognizes education as a human right in our peace agenda. That is the most concrete thing we can do to liberate young people. When people ask, why aren't young people as active as they were years ago? Well, then you talk about people who were able to get out of college debt-free and had a lot more choices, and it was a lot more realistic possibilities. So, end student debt. Education is a right.
Well, something I've really been pondering lately, one of the things about the war in Vietnam, and that did many more, but I remember, people remember that every night they do the death count. Remember during dinner, there's the body count. And I remember thinking, just how do I remove my individual complicity, and however you might want to do it. And there were two things that I'm really struck by. And one good thing about it, it's always good to question, but I remember when there was the Nazis going into a particular town and they said anyone who's Jewish has to wear the yellow Star of David. We're all going to wear the yellow Star of David. It didn't mean that you could not get killed or whatever, but I wonder if we think about what we can do, but I don't want to go that far. That'd be one example, but the other one was a call to resist. Does anyone remember this? It was a faith-based effort that said, the law was if you aided and abetted anyone, you could be like $10,000, whatever. But I thought about that, because then I said, sign me up. I mean, what is it, and it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but what is it about how me, but not just me, individual people, however you are, or whoever you live and where you are, because there's something about that dynamic. Jesse Helms did not serve 1 day in jail. Thousands of people went to that death because Senator Jesse Helms from the state of North Carolina. You think about who's being sent over there. You know what's happening. They're disposable. But I really been, and Vicki, I'm thinking about you in particular. What is it about? I don't know. But here's something I might try. And if you start to collectivize that, remember how you start a fire? You don't start a big old log. You get some twigs. The twigs, you know, if you think of it in that way, that's a whole different dynamic about, wait a minute now. You know, if that's how you kind of make that burning, whatever that might be. I have a lot of hope and aspirations, and I want to just share one thing. We were talking about this. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Anyone remember that? Duck and cover, run about, you know. We thought our lives were going to come to an end. And I remember when Kennedy got assassinated in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd. I remember thinking, you can't kill the president. The man's just a man. All you know is all you know. And depending on who you are, how you've been raised, who's around you, what are the opportunities? And so in one way, I think the more questions and the more challenges we might have, but again, what is the essence of whatever that thing, whatever that thing is? There's something going on with that, and that makes me hopeful in that way. But that thing about whatever it might be, I'll be willing to be that person. I'll stand in for you if that's what that means. And there's no guarantee, none whatsoever. But you know, you're trying to do whatever they do to make that change. So keep hope alive, y'all.
I think that family, and I think that it's important that we begin to talk to our family, you know, our young children. In my neighborhood, I always reach out and ask kids just simple questions, like what's going on, going to school, what are you doing? You know, and that's how I have a chance to have dialogue where I can begin to say, well, did you think about this? Or did you think about that? Or they may ask me something and I may have some information for them. Or I can tell them where to look, which is important. And so I think one of the things, and I remember traveling the world and trying to help all these people, but if I can't help my family, then what good is it? What good is it if I can't talk to my nieces, my nephews, you know, my children, my sons, and impart something in them? Because what I found out, when I instilled some things in them, they told their friends, and then they told their friends, and then some people coming up asking me stuff, like, oh, well, how'd you, well, your son told me such and such, or I heard it from you, you know, and so that's one of the things I think that we have to do. We have to act locally initially so we can understand and where our community is and get a group and formulate nuclear groups within our community that we can communicate with other communities. So that's the thing that I've been trying to do since I've been doing this work. Thanks.
I just want to end saying that I'm so grateful and honored, and it's such a privilege to be here amongst you incredible organizers and activists that have been part of this War Resistance League for decades. 100 years is incredible. It just blows my mind. But my main purpose of coming here was to restore that hope. And it's so beautiful to understand that everyone in this room, and you incredible people as well, understand that hope still exists. And trust, family, questioning, having these dialogues are so important. And I know Moon and I, we both were speaking about the climate crisis and the nuclear war that's upon us. And I feel like we have to look at other international countries like France, Greece, Argentina, and all these other countries that had these massive movements. And it's a lot of the people over there, they work together. The people that don't have anything, from the working class to the middle class, we're working together. And I think we need a movement like that here, and that's what we're missing. And it goes back to, the economic justice is the same theme that I keep seeing. If we look back when, in the 60s or now, the theme is the same, and we keep seeing the same the same way the system is trying to control us. It's still happening, and the economic justice won't happen if we don't look past our egos and look at people as just people, and not look at them based on who they are, what they're doing. Just looking at them as a human being, there won't be any sort of justice and revolutionary justice in this country or anywhere. And U.S. is what the biggest superpower is, and it's on the verge of being in ruin. But if we don't start now, then what will happen? There won't be any entire world if we don't start questioning our own selves.
So, like Vicky, I don't go around often with too much hope, but I do get hope when I get chances to get together with some folks who are my elders and mentors, even if you guys are only a couple of years older. I get hope when I get together with my peers and colleagues from the draft registration era, great hairs that we're getting, Edward, Vince, and others. And I especially get hope, lots of hope, when I get to work with young people like Habiba and others, so thank you. The War Resisters League is celebrating its 100th anniversary all year. And this flyer is at the back of the room, and if you don't have it and haven't gotten involved, take a flyer. If you don't know about New York City War Resisters League or the national office, find out. And get involved in one of our projects. They will all be as fun as this one, if not more fun. We just heard from us a couple of days ago that the Intrepid War Museum is planning its own birthday party on August 6th, Hiroshima Day. Some of us think that's an invitation. Some of us think, oh my, they're asking us to do something, and we hate not to respond to those kinds of invitations. So please, get involved, celebrate resistance by building the resistance, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. Thank y'all.
Thank you all for being the war resistance.
They're back there.